Hi, everybody. So I'm delighted tonight to introduce our keynote speaker. So our keynote speaker is Niall Smith. He received his PhD in astrophysics from UCD in 1990 and is currently the head of research for MTU in Cork. He is also the co-founder and head of Blackrock Castle Observatory. The observatory was opened in 2007 and presently houses a robotic observatory alongside Ireland's first interactive science and discovery center. The Blackrock Castle Observatory has welcomed over 1.2 million visitors, and I was one of them, and is taking its educational workshop into school and communities to a further 200,000 students and general public. As the founder of the Blackrock Castle Observatory, Niall is very interested in encouraging more of the population, young and old, to gain a better understanding of the scientific method and its importance to society. He is a regular speaker at public events and has featured in both national and international news, media, and in relation to science and outreach. Niall has co-authored over 40 journal papers, supervised 11 postgraduate students, and won the SFI Research Image of the Year 2020 for the project he will talk about tonight. He writes a monthly column in the Irish Examiner called Sky Matters, where he muses about things he thinks are of interest to the public. Niall's research interests include developing instruments for high precision photometry from the ground, optical searches for extrasolar planets, and robotic telescope arrays. His personal interests include astronomy, football, music, and building stuff around the home. So without further ado, Niall, it's up to you.
Thank you very much for that. That's I don't know who you were talking about there, actually. So the 1990 will give you an idea. You mentioned about research leaders of the future, people who are going to drive for the future. I better get on with doing some driving right now, because I'm afraid at my age, maybe, I'm starting to look more in the mirror than what's out through the windscreen. So it's a real pleasure to be here tonight. I had no idea that we were going to use any word like keynote. I think there's just going to be a bunch of speakers speaking tonight, and I'm very pleased to be amongst them. I wanted to start my story, if you like. I have two slides, which I'm going to share with you during this brief presentation. A story about masks. So if we were to go back to December 2019, and I was to do something like this, you'd probably be thinking, what is he doing? Why is that going on? Now, we regularly know that if people do this type of thing, they get caught up in their glasses. We just do this. Or then somebody puts on one of these. That's okay too. Or if you're giving a presentation for Pint of Science, then somebody puts on one of these. But the key thing is that in 2019, any of these would have seemed strange. Now they're just part of what we do. Hopefully that's going to change into the future. So my background is in astronomy and astrophysics. So why am I going to talk about masks tonight? Well, if we roll back to about March of last year, I was listening to the Pat Kenny show on News Talk in the car. And there was a chap from the Czech Republic who was talking about how they were making masks because masks were helping to stop the spread of coronavirus. And we really knew very little about coronavirus at the time. We didn't know, did it spread primarily through hands? I mean, if you remember, there was all this hand sanitization going on. Was it primarily airborne or what? What sort of contact was required to transfer the virus? And so as a physicist with no virology background, I just thought, actually, this guy seems to be making some sense. And I think this is, for me, a first lesson. Never imagine that somebody isn't making sense just because they're not necessarily a scientist. This guy was not a scientist, but he was kind of quoting some data, which was that you had a lot of people making masks in homes and all the rest, and that this was helping to suppress the virus, which it did in the Czech Republic. Unfortunately, incidentally, in more recent times, they stopped using masks, and the number of coronavirus cases has gone up. But we know a lot more about that now anyway. So we started thinking that's an interesting idea about masks. So what is that masks might do that actually frustrate COVID-19? So we did a little bit of research, and we found that it's primarily airborne through particles, which are effectively fluids that come out of your mouth. So they can be just the breaths in your breath, or the spittle when you're talking, and if you're excited, then you have more spittle, and if you talk loud, you've got more exhalations again. So we started to think, okay, that's kind of interesting. That's how it happens, but how can we do something about this to do with astronomy? And it was at that moment, in the New England Journal of Medicine, a paper was published in which an image that I'm just about to show appeared. And it's the image here on the left-hand side of the slideshow. So if you look at it, the green series of dots and so on. And what I just wanted to focus on the left-hand side. And if you're listening on the radio or not looking at this, I want you to imagine a series of dots on the screen. What this is showing is somebody talking, and there's a laser beam, and as their exhalations go through the laser beam, it's actually a cough, but it's the same principle. The particulates coming out of their mouth, which I'm going to refer to from now on as droplets, as they pass through the laser beam, they reflect light back towards the camera, and so they light up. Fairly simple. But on the right-hand side of this two pictures image, we have a star field. And in the star field, what do we see? Well, it's not exactly the same, but it looks kind of similar. On the right-hand side, a series of dots, which are stars very far away. On the left-hand side, a series of dots from objects which are minuscule, in fact, maybe smaller than the width of a human hair, but very close to us. So for those of you who are fans of Father Ted, you've got the famous scene of the cow out in the field looks very small because it's very far away, and so on. So in the same way, what we're doing here is we're detecting light. In one instance, there's a lot of light being emitted by the astrophysics objects, these stars. And on the other hand, the droplets are reflecting a very small amount of light, but because they're close, the net effect of what you detect is pretty much the same. And so then we thought the following: well, we spend a lot of our lives, wrapped up in dark rooms away from the general public, which is probably the safest place for us. And we've been trying to measure the brightness of objects in the sky for years and years and years. And for the most part, most people would say, well, that's not maybe particularly useful to society. And of course, we can have that debate about fundamental science and applied science. But in this instance, we could say that particular application, which would measure the brightness of objects with exquisite precision, what if we could measure the brightness of the objects in the frame on the left, the COF frame, and then associate that with the size of the particles coming out of the COF? So we decided to put in an application for funding. We got some funding from Science Foundation Ireland to look at how we could use the technique of looking at the brightness of stars to use it to measure the brightness of particles in a COF. Or now we're starting to move away from the COF and moving back towards particles that would go through a mask. So the question that we would ask, of which there were many, is, does this mask behave differently to this mask in two ways? Does it allow more particles through? And are the particles bigger or smaller? What's the distribution of the particle sizes? So as an example, suppose this mask lets just as many through as the next one, but it breaks them up into very, very small particles. So ultimately, when you add it all together, it's the same amount, but breaks up into very, very small. And suppose those small particles then, they can easily disperse in the air. So maybe they're not so dangerous to you indoors, because if I'm talking, the particles coming through the mask are gradually just sort of filtering around, and maybe they go out the window, a lot of them, rather than into your lungs. Whereas if we take another mask, maybe the particles are bigger. And so these might travel less far, but if they get into your lungs, a bigger particle maybe would have more virus. Now, remember, we were a bunch of physicists and astrophysicists, so we didn't really know this. So we, of course, talked to the virologists, and they said, there's this thing called viral load. And a couple of weeks later, we were experts on viral load. In reality, all that it meant for us was a bigger particle is likely to have more virus particles in it. So if it gets into your lungs, there's more virus particles. And just from a physicist's perspective, that doesn't sound good. So what we needed to do was find materials that reduce the number of these larger particles in the first instance, and then ideally to stop them altogether. But there's a problem. I mean, there's various conservation laws in this universe. And one of them is that while you can convert matter into energy and vice versa, talking to a mask ain't going to do that. You're not going to do any conversion of matter here. So whatever comes out your mouth has to go somewhere. It's either getting stuck in the mask, it's going through the mask, Or, as we got into the research, we found it does what all good Dad's Army aficionados will know, and most of you are probably way too young to remember Dad's Army, but the enemy just goes around the problem. And that's what the virus particles can do. If you have a mask that's ill-fitting, they simply don't go through the material, they don't get stuck in the material, they just go out through holes that are left by an ill-fitting mask. So the routes where these particles can get from your lungs, through your mouth, through your nose, into the air, becomes quite complicated. And we thought, well, if we can measure directly the brightness of all these particles, going back to that image I showed you a few minutes ago, we can directly measure how many of different sizes come through different masks. And because it's an imaging technique, we can tell how many are coming from different parts. So again, if I put this on, and let's say, imagine I put it under my nose just for a second. By the way, under the nose is a really bad place. It's a really bad place to put your mask. Don't do it. If I do that, we can see through an imaging technique that most of the particles will come out through your nose. So not only could we measure their sizes, we could also tell from where they came. And so this is also a technique which is non-invasive. You don't need you need a sophisticated camera that can detect very low light levels. You need some form of laser beam. It doesn't have to be technically a laser beam. Actually, it turns out it's easier to do it with a laser beam. So that as the particles go through it, they light up, and that's when you can detect them. And so we developed a couple of different, because it was a team of us, not just me, all good stuff generally is done by teams of motivated individuals. So we developed, using our expertise, a cone of light that will come down over the face, and also planes of light. And we could arrange those in different ways so we could detect where the different particles are coming from. And that way we could tell how effective a mask was and where it was falling down in terms of its effectiveness. So we had moved from having a situation where we were measuring the brightness of stars to being able to see the sizes of the different particles that were coming and where they were coming out from. This is really important because while you can make masks which are really effective, I mean, we've been doing this for a long time. Medical masks can be almost 100% effective. And if you use all aspirators and so on, you can pretty much contain any virus. But you can't do it on a pandemic scale. So you're going to end up using relatively simple devices, using readily available materials that are going to be made sometimes by, as was put during that early interview with Pat Kenny, little old ladies in rural villages in Czechoslovakia. And so the question that we want to be able to answer quickly was, were they any use? And if so, how useful were they? And our research allowed us to start to answer that question. And I think one of the things to be very aware of is that if you wear a mask that is 60% effective and 60% of the population wear it, then it effectively reduces the spread of the virus to a linear. It doesn't become exponential, so it doesn't grow. It just basically moves along at an even pace. If you can be more than 60% effective or more than 60% of the population wear it, then you actually start to suppress the spread of the virus, of course. And that we saw that being done very effectively through various mechanisms. But this is one of the things from a physicist perspective as well. I mean, viruses, they're kind of, there's pandemics going on all the time. This was something that we only realized sometime into the whole thing. Viruses move across our planet all the time. It just so happens that coronavirus is particularly nasty when it gets into you. A lot of viruses get into you and nothing bad happens to them. So our research is trying to see, going forward, how we can actually suppress viruses in general. So the vaccines that we have at the moment are tailored for coronavirus. But what if there is some other type of coronavirus, and instead of COVID-19, COVID 2035 or something like that in 15 years' time? So masks will give us, because of the simple way that viruses move around, will give us a first line of defense always. So it's good for us to know, to get the time together to put new vaccines in if we